Well, thank you to Bill, and thank you all for coming out on a Wednesday evening. I've given you some previous lectures on Mesoamerican ceramics and South American ceramics and Andean textiles, and so I was casting about for a topic this time, and I thought, well, maybe the idea would be to cover a variety of topics of different media and to cover the whole range, geographic range. And so the topic I came up with was precious materials in the art of the pre-Columbian world. And precious materials, of course, is sort of a wide topic, and it's to some extent in the eyes of the beholder too. In order to keep this somewhat focused, I have limited the selection of precious materials, and so I'm going to start out with jade, go on to gold and silver, and then talk a little bit about feathers and, well, I guess feathers. So I'm going to start out with my slides now. There we go. Alrighty. Now, jade is Mesoamerica's earliest and most universally valued precious material. As many of you, I'm sure, know, jade is really a generic term for a hard, shiny green stone, and it's not a precise mineralogical term at all. Mineralogically, it comprises a whole spectrum of different materials that includes things like jadeite, omphacite, albitite. So it's really a spectrum of different materials that kind of merge together to some extent. And the reality is that most of the jades that you see in museums have never been tested by a geologist or a mineralogist. And so we don't truly know what exact minerals they are. And so typically what they get labeled is simply jade. And if they say jadeite, hopefully that means that somebody has actually done an analysis and is sure that that's what is involved. In Mesoamerica, in fact, all green stones were prized, and so it wasn't just the jades. It also included softer green stones, things like serpentine, which is relatively soft and easy to carve. And the point was really the green color itself, which was evocative of fertility and growth and abundance. And so that's why people valued green stones. They did in particular value the hard green stones like jade. And part of the reason for this is that jadeite is in fact one of the toughest minerals in existence. And by tough, I mean that it doesn't shatter. It's not the hardest thing out there, but it is really tough. It doesn't shatter easily. And so it is, for societies that don't have metal, it's really the ideal material for making axes that you can use for cutting down trees. And that's especially important for tropical agriculturalists. And so they began making jadeite axes, and eventually the symbolism began to take over. And so they weren't prized simply for their practical value, but more for their symbolic value. And especially this one on the right, you can see these jade axes are shaped rather like ears of corn. And this is part of the agricultural process, where first you cut down the trees and you burn the land, and then you plant corn on those plots. And so there's a strong connection between cutting wood and planting the staff of life, which is maize. And so people made this connection between jade axes and ears of maize. And so axes like these are really intended more as ritual objects than as practical ones. And so they have been very beautifully shaped and polished, and in many cases incised with religious symbolism. Okay. On the left is another of these jade axes. That one on the left is quite large, and it's incised with symbolism that shows the four directions and then the sprouting plants. Now this on the right is a very famous object known as the Kunz axe. It's from the American Museum of Natural History, and it's shaped like an axe, but it was never a practical object. It's way too large and heavy. And so what they did was they took a big chunk of jade and then they carved it into basically the shape of an axe, but then created the form of a divinity. And this is one of the principal Olmec divinities that's known as a weird jaguar, and you can recognize it by those sort of almond-shaped eyes and the snarling mouth. And the hands and body are human, but the face combines human and animal characteristics, and it's known as the weird jaguar. Now, true jadeite is in fact very rare, and the only known source of this material is in all of the Americas, in fact, is in Guatemala. And there's a lot of current research right now that's going on and is attempting to understand better the process of acquisition and the control over this resource and how this may have changed over time. The source of this jade was far from the Olmec heartland, which is on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And so one way or another, whether it was the Olmecs going to this region and obtaining the jade directly, or it was they went there and they traded for it with the people who controlled the source, or whether the people who controlled the source were then exporting it to other parts of Mesoamerica, we don't really know for sure, and it's a very important topic in the field. In any event, what's clear is that the Olmec had access to large quantities of high-quality jade, and they seem to have been real connoisseurs of the stone material itself. So if you look at this spoon on the left, they clearly utilized the variations in the visual characteristics of the stone and sort of optimized those in the way that they carved this object. On the right is an Olmec jade piece that shows the kind of jade that the Olmec seem to have particularly liked, which is this sort of bluish-green translucent color of jade, because jade can vary a great deal in coloration. This one on the right is quite a large object. So they seem to have had access to pretty large blocks of good quality jade.
Margaret, can I just ask you, do they know what that object could be used for?
That was a pendant, and the shape of it was the claw of a crocodile.
Oh,
Okay. Now, these are both examples of jadeite masks, and they are life-size. They could have been worn by either a living person or possibly have been used as funerary masks or placed on a mummy bundle or something of that nature. But these are carved from solid blocks of stone, and these ones, and some of the others as well, are carved all the way through so that they're pierced at the eyes and mouth and nose. And they're life-size. You can put, especially I tried this one on the right on, and you can put it right over your face and you can look right through it. And it's got a spooky effect when you see real eyes staring out of those eye holes. These are particularly realistic Olmec masks that seem very individualistic. They seem portrait-like, as though they focus on specific individuals. There are others that are considerably more generic than that, where it's probably a type rather than specific individuals. And they vary a great deal in size, and some are jadeite and some are other kinds of stone as well. A significant cache of masks, celts, and other ornaments was found at a site called Rio Pesquero in Veracruz. And it's a site, this was in the 1970s, and it's a site that was covered by water, and so it was really never properly excavated. And so we still don't know what the nature of that site was, whether it was possibly a shrine where offerings were deposited. There's another site called El Manatí where they seem to have made offerings at the site of a spring. So it's possible that it was an offering site, or it's also possible that it was a royal burial ground, and that these were all the accoutrements of Olmec kings who were buried at this spot. This is this is one mask, two different views of it. This one also shows that it's pierced through, but the eyes in particular are done in an unusual way, where they're sort of set down and then up, the connection to the interior. What you see on this one and some of the others also is that there is individual incising of religious symbols on the cheeks, and no two of them are alike.
Would they ever have had jewels put in the eye sockets, do you think?
Very possibly. I mean, I'm not sure why they would have done it quite this way unless they were going to put inlays in this particular case. That way you could have inlaid eyes and you could still see out through it. Other ones, there are some masks that are not pierced, and they didn't really smooth off all of the drill pits in the eyes, and so it makes you suspect that they were intended to be covered with something set into them, because they didn't polish them and perfect the surface the way they would if it was going to be seen, at least you imagine. Now, on the left is a very famous tableau of Olmec objects from the site of La Venta. This is one of the Olmec sites that has been more thoroughly excavated than others, and so they have been able to get a pretty good map of the site, and they excavated a number of caches and ritual deposits at the site, and this is one of those that they found. And it was set up just this way, with all the figures upright and the cells, and they seem to have been arranged into a sort of dramatic scene. And there's a good deal of variation among the different figures. They're made out of different materials, and you really get the sense that they're depicting something very specific here, but we'll probably never quite know. And the archaeologists were even able to discern when they excavated this piece that it had been buried in the earth in this fashion, and then at some later time people came back, excavated it down at least low enough to find out that all the pieces were still there, and then covered it up again. So it was a ritual deposit that was then revisited and reused at a later date. I guess maybe the celts are that tall. And then this little figurine on the right is another Olmec object that was buried in an offering at La Venta with a whole cache of jade objects. This is one of the figurines that we think is female. The great majority of them are male, or they seem to be sort of asexual where you can't really tell what sex they are, but this one appears to be a female figure.
Is that jade? What is it?
I think that one is not jade. I think that's more of a, well, not true jade, it's more of a green stone. Now, as I said, some of the jade objects, Olmec jade objects, seem very realistic and seem to portray specific individuals. Others are much less individualistic, and this kind of illustrates that. The figure on the right is clearly a very specific person. Those are very distinctive, very individual features. This figure has been called a woman too, but I don't know. If it's a woman, she's got very heavy, tough-looking facial features. The figure on the left illustrates more the generic, idealized facial depiction, and the emphasis seems to be much more on the costuming. The headdress in particular, if you look at that, the headdress is really out of scale with the rest of the figure. The body is rather small, the head is quite large, and then the headdress is very large. So the emphasis seems to be less on the specific person than it is on the office. Now on the left there is the large figure seems to be pretty much human, but he's holding this baby-like creature, or maybe a masked baby, that would seem to be one of the Olmec divinities. And there are altars that show human beings interacting with these sort of strange dwarf-like creatures that have small, pudgy human bodies, but then these strange faces on them. And so this is probably an Olmec ruler who has been involved in a ritual and has been in contact with this supernatural being. At least one of the interpretations is that it may be some kind of a spirit that's associated with the earth or with rain, and so it would be the ruler's job to serve as the intermediary with these spirits. And then this figure on the right has a pretty much human body. It's wearing a costume, but the face is, again, it has this snout and a face that may indicate either that it's a supernatural being or possibly that it's a human being who is transforming himself into another being. You've probably all heard about the notion of a weir jaguar, which is the idea that the Olmec shamans could transform themselves into alter egos, animals, especially jaguars. And both of these pieces, which are from Dumbarton Oaks, are considered to be possible examples of that. The one on the left, the body is upright, but it has distinctly animal characteristics in the build and the way it's depicted, and then the face is sort of feline, just somewhere halfway in between feline and human. So this could be a shaman who's in the process of transformation. And then on the right is a figure that is almost entirely jaguar, except that he's standing up in a very human pose. indicating that he's not simply and he's gripping something too with his hands. So it's not simply a naturalistic depiction of an animal. Some current research is indicating that there really are important and strong connections between the Olmec and the Maya, the early Maya. It probably involved religious information and very possibly the cult of rulership. And so there's, for instance, there is an early Maya mural that is in the process of being excavated and studied now. And one of the divinities shown in this mural, and the whole thing is in Maya style, early Maya style, but the face of this divinity looks distinctly Olmec. And these two objects are sort of evidence, or additional evidence, of the connection between the Maya and the Olmec, because these would seem to have been heirloom objects. They were clearly Olmec-made objects that seem to have been at some later time owned and to some extent reworked by Maya people. So if you look at this one on the right, it has an Olmec face, and then on the left you see two little Maya glyphs. And they're clearly Maya glyphs, they're not Olmec. So this would have to have been done at a later time. And the object itself seems to be fragmentary. It's something that was broken and yet it was still prized and treasured centuries later. This one on the left is another Olmec object, and it's quite intact. And unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of the back of it, but it has incised on it a seated Maya ruler and then a whole glyphic inscription in an early Maya style. So these would seem to be pretty concrete evidence that the Maya were aware of and cherished these relics of the Olmec period. Now, for whatever reason, for the most part, the Maya do not seem to have had access to the same large-size, high-quality pieces of jade that the Olmec had. You can see this one on the left. That's a big piece of stone, but it's not that really beautiful, translucent, fine-grained jade that the Olmec masks were made of. And then this one on the right is not jade at all. It's fusite. These are both early classic Maya masks, and you can see the change over time. There's still this emphasis on greenstone, but you can see a stylistic change. These are both clearly divinities rather than human beings. Now, especially in later times, in the late classic period, the Maya seem to have used, because they didn't have access to the big pieces, big solid pieces of jade, instead they really made the best use of what they did have, and they became masters at really cutting and fitting jade into beautiful mosaics. And so the mask on the left is from the ruler, the most famous ruler of Palenque, named Pakal. This was his funerary mask. And then this one on the right is from Tikal. It's probably not quite correctly reassembled. It would have been done on a wooden form originally, and that had decayed away. So when the archaeologists found this, it was in pieces, and they would have had the approximate location, and they put it together as best they can, but there's some argument about the exact positioning of some of the elements of this. The Maya are also known for these plaques, which they seem to have worn as breast pendants. They're pierced through, and they show again how the Maya were sort of maximizing their use of these pieces of jade. So the one on the left is a nice green color, and they didn't want to sort of lose any of that jade by trimming it and making it into an even shape. So instead, they made the design conform to the original shape of that piece that they had. And they cut these into, they sawed them into relatively thin pieces so that, again, you could get the highest number of objects out of a chunk of jade. And the one on the right is, well, it's hard to know whether all of that discoloration is from the original stone or some of it may have been later deposition and staining. But it's a masterful carving out of what seems like not the greatest piece of jade. But they typically show a ruler in a seated pose and looking very authoritative. These are two examples of jade ornaments from, or at least in the style of the site of Copan. And you can see that they're quite baroque, both of them. Now this piece on the left, again, is a small piece of jade where they have made the best use of it and only trimmed it a little bit around the edges to make it conform to the profile of the image that they wanted, which is a divinity. And this would have been worn as an ornament, possibly on a headdress or on the costume somewhere. And then this group on the left, we see this same assemblage in Maya portraits on stele and things like that, and it's called a belt assemblage. And it typically consists of 3 dangling celts and then a mask up above. And in this one you can see again that it's a mosaic of very thin pieces of jade. And the same thing is true with those celts down below. They've taken a celt and they've sawed it into pieces. So each one of those is quite thin, and it would seem to again show that they are maximizing their use of the precious material. And I should say that, because jade is such a tough material and quite hard, you can't carve it. You have to abrade it. And so when I say they sawed it, they would use grit and something like leather or some sort of a cord and just saw through it very, very laboriously. And then to drill holes, again, you'd use sand or some kind of an abrasive and drill through it. But you can't carve it because they had no materials that you could use to do that. Now, this is another of those belt celts, and this is the most famous example that's known. It's called the Leiden plaque. It's been known since the late 19th century. And so this is one of those objects that was worn and dangling from a ruler's belt. There probably were 2 more. It would have been part of a set. And on one side, on one face, it shows a ruler wearing all of his finery. And then on the, and actually you can see him in the front. He's wearing one of those belt assemblages with a little mask and then dangling celts. See if I can, right there. This is belt celt, yeah, right. Front and in back. And then on the reverse is an inscription. And in many ways the composition is very similar to a Maya stela, where on the front they have the portrait of the ruler, and then on the back they have an inscription that tells about his lineage and his right to rule and his important successes. Now, jade was also cherished beyond the technical boundaries of Mesoamerica and to the south in Costa Rica. And interestingly enough, we also find in Costa Rica heirloom objects that were made by the Maya, usually early classic Maya, or by the Olmec. But interestingly enough, they often are not complete. Instead, they have been reused and reworked, and sometimes, by our standards, mutilated. And you sort of wonder, because this on the left is clearly an Olmec mask, and a beautiful Olmec mask, and you sort of wonder why anybody would slice it up that way. And there are any number of explanations for why that would happen. One could be that the material itself was more precious, and they weren't so interested in what the Olmec had done with it. They would rather make their own object, but in this case they didn't make much out of it. And then another possibility is that it may have been sort of like the use of, say, a copper at a potlatch, where the object is inherently extremely valuable, and you could cut it up into pieces, and the sacredness and power of that object would inhere in each of the pieces, and you could distribute that to honored guests or people who were very important. And so that was more important than maintaining the object as an intact single item, to distribute the power and distribute the wealth that way. This piece on the right is a fragment of one of the Maya belt celts, and actually quite a few of these fragments have been found in Costa Rica, but very few of them intact. They mostly have been carved up to one extent or another. And in this case, you can see from those 2 holes on the side that it was intended to be worn horizontally. The original hole is up there at the top, and it would have been hanging vertically, but once it was reused by its Costa Rican makers, they were intending to display it horizontally, probably as a breast pendant.
Those hieroglyphics on it?
Yes.
Can they be read?
Well, the early classic script is the one they're having, it's the most challenging part right now, and they're making a lot of strides, but there's still a lot of unanswered question. So they're still working on the early classic. They're still working on the late classic too, but they are a lot further ahead there. Now, it would seem likely that the people in Costa Rica were importing ready-made celts, probably from Guatemala. And this one on the left is an intact celt that is from Costa Rica. And so it could have been imported right in that shape and then reworked in Costa Rica. And one reason to think that is that an awful lot of Costa Rican ornaments still show that the evidence of that original shape, that it was once a celt and then it got modified, sliced in half, often again made into various shaped components, but often you can see evidence that the original form there was a celt. And so it suggests that they may well have been importing celts as pre-manufactured objects from the place of origin, which was probably Guatemala, unless there's a site, another place of, another source that hasn't yet been discovered, which is always one of the great quests in Mesoamerica, is to find additional sources of jadeite. Many of these objects were worn as breast pendants. They're usually drilled through side to side, usually around the neck area. They were probably worn as pendants for the most part. And it does seem like they liked the same color of jade that the Olmec did typically. So they went for the sort of darker grayish green, bluish green color of jade. Jade was worked in Costa Rica from for nearly 1,000 years, from about 200 BC to 8700, and it's about that time that its role as the most precious material was supplanted by gold, which was a new material, a new prestige material that was coming from the south. On the left is another of these pendants. In this case, it's an avian pendant, and then on the right, this is a what you call a bar bead, and it's actually about 11 inches long. It's a really big piece of stone. It would have been worn horizontally, and it's drilled all the way through, which is quite a feat. And these things are very heavy, too. You can't quite imagine wearing them. Now, these pieces of jade come from eastern Costa Rica, what's called the Atlantic Watershed region, and you can see the workmanship where the holes have been drilled through, again using this drilling and abrading process, and then they've sawed it. So once you drill the hole, then you can insert the string or leather and grit and then saw it down. And so you can see that in the way that both of these pieces have been worked, or all of them. And again, you can admire the beauty of the stone itself, the translucent quality where it's at the tip there down where it's quite thin and narrow. And again, you can still see that celt shape. That would have been the bottom blade of the celt down at the feet, and then it's thicker as it goes up. And so it's been modified, but you can still see that basis. A couple of more ornaments. And I should say most of these pieces are from the collection here. We have one of the great Costa Rican jade collections in the world. A couple more. Both of these are quite heavy too. Okay. Well now, whereas jade was the most precious material in Mesoamerica throughout its history, there seems to be no doubt that metallurgy originated in South America. And so, to the best of our knowledge, the first metallurgy was working with gold and was about 1100 BC in Peru. And it may well be that future discoveries will push that further back, but that's where it stands currently. Now, gold occurs in nature in nearly pure form, so you don't have to do too much if you start with a nugget of gold or gold, little grains of gold, because it's nearly pure, it's easily melted, it's very malleable, you can spread it extremely thin, and then what's more, it's very there's a word for this. What I mean is unchangeable. It doesn't tarnish, it doesn't degrade, it will last almost forever. So it's really a wonderful material for making prestige goods with. And this on the left is just an illustration of taking gold and making it into a thin sheet, and you can really spread it extraordinarily thin. Sheet gold working it was the first invented technique in South America, and it seems to have always remained the favorite. They invented casting at a later time and did use it, but it seems to have never been quite as popular as working with sheet metal. Now this on the right is a Chavin-style object, a crown, and you can see that it's made with a sheet of gold that has been pushed out in the back to create the image on it, and it's very dense. This is very typical of Chavin religious imagery. It's very much like what you see in stone sculpture as well. I'll show you a few more pieces. This one on the left is one of a pair. This one is from Dumbarton Oaks, and there's another mate to it in the collection in Cleveland. So these were probably part of a headdress ornament or possibly some other kind of costume element. But again, it shows a Chavin divinity, a fanged divinity. And then on the right is, again, a piece that's been made out of sheet gold. They've cut the outline and they have pressed the design out. And then it has recessed areas that may have been inlaid with some material like stone or shell. And again, this is an ornament that probably would have been sewed onto costume or a headdress or something along those lines. On the left, this is from an ear spool, and it would have been just the front of an ear spool. The rest of it might have been made out of wood or shell or something like that. So this is the decorative portion that would have been right on the front of it. Very intricate shape, the way they've cut the outlines. And then on the right is, there's just a handful, and undoubtedly there were more, but very few have survived, but there's just a handful of these incredible three-dimensional objects that have been made out of sheet metal, and it's been very carefully cut and formed and shaped and joined at certain areas to create three-dimensional images. In the collection in Cleveland, there's another of these spoon-like objects, and it shows a little human figure holding a panpipe, and then this one is a monkey. And this one's from the collection in Dumbarton Oaks. We don't really know what the spoons were used for, but there are several of these Chavin spoons known. Some researchers at least think that they were using for snuffing hallucinogens.
Margaret?
Mm-hmm.
Where would this ear spool have come from specifically? Do they know that?
I don't think they do know the place of origin on that particular piece. There have been a few finds, like in the north coast of Peru. They found some materials there, and they have also found some in the highlands.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Now, silver is more difficult to mine, and it has to be smelted and refined before it can be used. So its use came in at a later time than gold. So they had already worked out a lot of the metalworking techniques with gold, and then they moved on to silver. And the earliest known specimens of worked silver come from the site of Kunturwasi and seem to have been made about 500 BC. So with the available evidence, at least, it seems to have lagged by about 500 years behind gold working. And I don't have pictures of those pieces. They're not really terribly impressive. The people who are better known for using silver and then combining it with gold as well are the Moche, and they date to about 100 to 800 AD, and they really took metallurgy to a higher technical level than had been done previously. Now the one on the left doesn't really exemplify that because it's very similar to the previous ones where it's just sheet gold that has an incised and repoussé design, quite an intricate one though. But this one on the right is quite something. It's a life-size mask, and they have combined gold and silver, and probably part of the reason you would combine these two metals is just to create a pleasing contrast of colors. So I'm sure that some of it was aesthetic, but I'm also sure that some of it was probably symbolic. And we don't really know what the symbolic meaning of the different metals was, and undoubtedly it would have varied from one culture to another. But there does seem to be some evidence that there was a fairly widespread connection between gold and the sun and males, and silver and the moon and females, which is sort of a very broad cross-cultural kind of association as well. The Moche used not only the hammering technique, but they also used lost wax casting and gilding, including depletion gilding, and they were also able to make metallurgical joins. And many of the Moche objects are truly spectacular. Many of you have probably heard of the site of Sipan, where they found a series of incredible burials of what seemed to have been rulers and religious figures, and incredible quantities of just absolutely spectacular metal jewelry. These two examples show you, the one on the left is a nose ornament. That little opening there at the top goes through the septum of the nose. And so then it would hang down, it would cover the mouth, and then go up like this on either side of the face. And in this case, they've used both gold and silver. And you can see that there's sort of that duality between the two in the way that they have composed the image. And then on the right, this is a headdress ornament, and it has the face with shell inlays, and it also has lots of little dangling elements on it. It would make it really shimmer in the sunshine. And they also like to combine gold with other precious materials like turquoise and shell and pyrite. And so these are two Moche ear spools, very high status examples. If you look at the ones on the right, you can see that even the shafts that would go through the earlobe are decorated. Now, Moche's cultural successors on the North Coast, and the North Coast seems to have been the big seat of metallurgy in the ancient Andes. The cultural successors of the Moche were the Sican people, which is not to be confused with Sipan, which is the Moche site. This is the culture of Sican. It's also called Lambayeque sometimes because it's from the Lambayeque region. And the Lambayeque were really large-scale producers of metal objects. Only a limited number of tombs have been archaeologically excavated, but there's some famous ones that were not archaeologically excavated and produced huge quantities of precious metal and also huge quantities of copper. They clearly associated the different kinds of metal with wealth, and they placed them differentially in tombs, so gold seems to have had the highest status. Copper was valuable, but nowhere near as valuable as gold, and so you can deduce the rank of the individual based on how much they have of the different kinds of materials in their tomb. But they literally buried some people with hundreds of pounds of metal. And stylistically, one of the ways that you can recognize Sican art is those comma-shaped eyes that sort of come up to a corner at the outside, come to a point at the outside corners. And you see that both on the mask on the left and then on that little figure on the right. And this is considered sort of the identifying emblem of the Sican Lord. And we don't really know whether the Sican Lord is a deity or maybe it's a mythical ruler or a legendary ruler, something like that. But his image seems to be omnipresent, and in death people wanted to associate themselves with him. And so these masks like this were placed over the face of the deceased, and then they were also buried with objects that had the image of the figure on them. These objects are called tumi knives. I'm not really sure why that is, but it's the shape, that sort of rounded blade shape down there. And these ones have really elaborate handles and clearly were intended more for decoration and symbolic value than they were as practical tools. but they're extremely elaborate in terms of the way that they're put together. And the most elaborate examples will include gold, silver, turquoise, copper, and sometimes cinnabar. And they're incredibly intricately worked. And it's, of course, that same image with the pointy eyes. On the left is a sheet gold Lambayeque vessel, and it's a replica in gold of a form that's really quite common in ceramic. The Lambayeque people did blackware ceramic vessels. They typically have this double spout shape with the two diverging spouts and a bridge in between them. Mostly they're simpler in shape than that, but the most elaborate ceramic ones are of this same general type. But there's just a handful of these replicas made in sheet gold that are really incredible. And then this on the right is an example of how gold could even be incorporated into clothing. So it didn't just have to be part of your jewelry, you could actually wear it on your costume. And so this is a cloth tunic that is completely covered with plaques of gold that have been stitched to the cloth. And you can imagine how spectacular something like that would be, especially if you're then wearing a lot of elaborate jewelry and feathers and colored shell and things like that. It would, and elaborate, beautiful textiles as well, brightly colored fans, all kinds of stuff. It would be spectacular. And the Sipan and Chimu people, I think, were really the masters of ostentatious display in South America. Now I mentioned Chimu. Chimu are sort of the successors to Lambayeque. The Chimu were actually a kingdom based at Chanchan. That was their capital, and they seem to have conquered most of the north coast, including the Lambayeque area where the Sikan people were located. And probably because they were very closely culturally affiliated to begin with, and then they probably took over a lot of the craftsmen from the Sikan people. It's often pretty hard to distinguish between Lambayeque or Sikan and Chimu metallurgy. And there was a show of silver that was done at the Metropolitan a few years ago, and the author there tried to distinguish between Sikan and Lambayeque, and I don't think she didn't even claim that she was able to reliably distinguish between the two. But this one on the right is probably Sikan based on those eyes. This one on the left, I don't know. I don't really know whether that's Chimu or Sikan. But they both show that use of the two metals together. Now, this piece on the left is a form, and it gives you an idea of how some of these pieces were made. And you would take the sheet metal and you would hammer it and anneal it and mold it over the form to create the shape, the desired shape. And this on the right is the kind of object that would have been made using one of those forms.
You then peel it off the form or get rid of the form?
You'd pull it out, so you'd have to make sure you left a big enough opening that you could extract it.
Is that silver on the right?
Yeah, that one on the right is silver.
Usually silver doesn't come through that well, does it, over these many centuries?
Well, that's true. I mean, silver does, it tarnishes and corrodes much more than gold. And so especially if it's been in a damp environment or a salty environment, it will often corrode heavily. And you've seen some examples where it's dark rather than being shiny. So there are some where, for whatever reason, it had better preservation conditions and has been well preserved. And in this case, I'm sure they shined it up a little bit before they photographed it. And this is two silver discs. There are a series of these discs known. They don't really know for sure what they were used for. They could have been shield covers, something along those lines. About like so. They're not real big for a full-size shield, but they may have been more for display purposes, or it could have been something else entirely. But there's a series of them that are known. They all have this round boss in the center, and then concentric rings of very dense imagery on them. And these pieces are quite closely related to the 2 silver cups that we have upstairs in the gallery. A couple more ornaments. This one on the left showing really intricate use of cutout and dangling elements, and then on the right another of these cups, but in this case of silver, with a maritime design on it. So this one on the right shows incised decoration, and on the left the repoussé. And you can see on that vessel on the left how they made it in a couple of pieces. There's the lower part of the vessel that was attached to the upper part, and then the spout seems to have made separately, and then they joined those separately made pieces. And again, there are not very many of these, but they're really impressive. These 3-dimensional figures made out of sheet metal that's been hammered and formed to create 3-dimensional figures. And so on the left is a panpipe blower, and then the figure on the right, the arms are actually articulated. And you can see what he's holding. It's one of those cups, one of those head-shaped cups.
What's the age of these?
These are Chimu, so they're probably about 1100 to 1400 AD.
Margaret, has the wooden form and that one on the right just been put in there to hold it together, or did that come?
I think that one is original. I think that's part of it. And so it had a form inside of it to support it. Now, from the accounts of the conquerors, we know that the Inca were really producers of absolutely spectacular metal objects. And there are those who say that, in fact, precious metals were the most important medium for the Inca, perhaps even more important than textiles or ceramics or architecture. And some of the reason we know that is because of the accounts of the conquerors. When they encountered these areas, they were extremely impressed, and they wrote about it. One of the things that they wrote about was buildings that were covered with gold, literally probably sheet gold, but they were literally covered in huge amounts of gold. And they also wrote about things like at the temple in Cusco, that there was a whole garden that was made out of gold and silver. All the plants, even the rocks and the pebbles, the animals, the people were all made out of, perfectly crafted gold. And people really marveled, the Spanish really marveled at this, and then they melted it all down. And probably, the single event that accounts for an awful lot of the destruction of Inca metalwork was the ransoming of Atahualpa, because the Spanish demanded a room full of gold to ransom him. And it was brought from all corners of the empire. They allowed people the time to gather it up and bring it all to Cusco and fill up this room. They had a mark on the wall to say how high it had to be. And they actually did this. They succeeded. They brought incredible quantities of gold, and then the Spanish killed them anyway. But at any rate, pretty much all of that material was melted into bullion. And so what survives is the material that wasn't found during the conquest period or colonial period, and that is largely offering objects that were placed on top of mountains or were dropped in, into lakes or the ocean, or hidden in caves, offering spots that were inaccessible and were forgotten about. And most of the objects that we have now are little votive objects. Some are bigger than others, but it's usually human figures, male and female figures. They're made out of gold or silver or sometimes shell as well. And then there are llamas as well that are made out of the same materials. And these were, they were sacrificial objects, and they sometimes accompanied real human sacrifices, and sometimes they were probably substitutes for human and real animal sacrifices. This on the right is a child sacrifice that was found in Chile up on top of a mountain, and is extraordinarily well preserved by the conditions up there. And you can see there, just below the elbow, is one of these figurines, and it's wearing the original costume. This one on the left probably would have been wearing that kind of costume as well. It just hasn't been preserved because of the conditions where it was found. Or in some cases, you know, in the past, the textiles weren't highly valued. They knew gold was valuable, but they didn't know textiles were valuable, so they would strip it off and throw it out. But on the one on the right, you can see this incredible, perfectly made clothing to scale for the object. And males wear male costume, females wear female costume, and the figurine is even wearing this very elaborate feather headdress.
Where is that now?
It's in Chile in the Natural History Museum in Santiago. It wasn't on display when I was there. Sort of, I think, in kind of a refrigerated setting, and they have a photograph of it. But as you know, they found other mummies in recent times. Now that the glaciers are melting, there's been sort of a push to try and go up and recover as many of these as possible before things melt, because in many cases the human bodies are not mummified, they're simply frozen, and so if they start to thaw, they won't be well preserved. Now, we know that while not so much gold has survived from the Inca period, a great deal has survived from Colombia, and that's because most of this was placed in tombs. And this is a technology that seems to have moved north from Peru, where it originated, into Colombia, and they had a great deal of gold available to them and produced some really spectacular traditions. This is from one of the earliest traditions, Calima, which began about 300 BC and continued with developments and variations up until about 800 AD. And these are sheet gold. I realize that it's 8 o'clock now, so I'm going to move ahead more quickly and not do as much talking, just try and get to show you all of the objects. These are more examples of sheet gold. This is a funerary mask with hinged eyes on the right, and on the left, this is a big object. It looks like a tweezer. It is a tweezer shape, but it's about that big, and they're usually found in pairs, and they may have hung from the elbows. But these have been found in burials, particularly at a site called Balagana. There's some sheet gold objects, and then this on the right is a cast figurine, and they used more casting in Colombia and then in Central America. It seems to have been a more important technique there. And this obviously shows a ceremonialist who is holding batons or perhaps rattles and then wearing an elaborate mask. These are lime dippers. They're quite long. They can be like so long, and they're used for dipping into a container of lime that you then chew with your coca. And they have these elaborate heads that are cast. So there you can see the whole thing. This is a little out of focus, but it is a side view of that figure. Very often they have something on their back, the way this one does, and he's wearing a mask. Two more views of another figure. And these are very sophisticated because they seem to have used, deliberately used different colored alloys, so that when they cast it in, you'll look at one of these and you'll see that say that element on the back is a pink gold, and there's a different part that's a yellow gold and a more white gold. It's remarkable that they were able to place these different parts using the different metals in a single casting. These are late Calima pieces. They tend to be made out of sheet gold, and they have a lot of dangling elements. This one would have been a pectoral or possibly a headdress element, but it shows a face, and the face is wearing ornaments that are hanging from that face. And then this is a nose ornament, and again, those little things would go through the septum of the nose, and it would really dangle and shimmer and jingle. Now, this is Quimbaya style, which is about 0 to 800 AD. It's one of my favorite styles. They did both casting and hammering, but they feature these beautiful smooth surfaces and a lot of human forms that are always very sleek and smooth, and they have these extremely serene expressions on their faces. So that one on the left is a helmet. Now these are lime containers. This is the kind of thing that you would dip your long dipper into to get the lime out. So then you'd lick it off and use the lime with your coca. And this one on the right I like. Again, it shows those round forms, but it's in a very organic shape, like a gourd. And these are two more lime containers, but in the form of human beings with just these sublime expressions. And they have both male and female versions. Some are standing, more often they're seated. This is another style from northern Colombia called Tairona. These are both nose ornaments. And on the left, you can see it's easy enough to see how that would go through your nose. This one would require a little more stretching. These are Tairona pendants. These are the two major forms. One is this bird shape with a big projecting beak, and then the one on the right is what they call a little chieftain figure. And they always have these extremely pugnacious looking expressions on their faces, and very elaborate headdresses. And in some cases, the ear spools and ornaments are cast in place, and yet they're free dangling. This is muisca, which is a late tradition. These were made as votive offerings, so they're a little bit, they're a little crude compared to many of the earlier styles. They were made as offerings, and they were placed in deposits. But they typically show human figures, males and females, with all of their costume and holding various kinds of objects like babies sometimes, weapons, cups, snuff trays, all kinds of things. Those on the left are snuff trays. And you can see how similar the form is to the Tiwanaku snuff trays, but they're cast out of gold. And then this one on the right is by far the most elaborate, complex example of muisca gold known, and it shows a raft with all sorts of human figures on it. And it's often interpreted as a representation of the El Dorado myth. Now these are both from Panama. Because gold technology continued working its way up north. It's the same, at this point it's the same technology. There aren't really any new inventions. This one on the left is a breast plaque, would be about so big. These were found in Sitio Conte, which is a site that was excavated by both Harvard and University of Pennsylvania. They found spectacular tombs that would typically have a principal individual and then a whole series of attendants that were buried with them. And some of those attendants would seem to have been high status themselves because they had offerings as well as the principal individual. But incredible quantities of pottery and gold and precious materials of all kinds were placed into these tombs.
What's the one on the right?
That one is a international style pendant, cast gold, with a lot of open work. And it's interesting with these sites because you actually see a mixture of different styles, because it does seem that these materials were traded. They were prestige goods and they were probably traded, given as gifts, so they worked their way around. And so a piece that you find in a grave in Panama may have actually been made in Colombia or Costa Rica or somewhere like that. These are a couple of pieces from Costa Rica. They're both breast pendants. They're both from our collection here. Ear spools and a bracelet. Again, both of these are made out of sheet gold that's been formed. These ones are cast gold pendants, and Costa Rican gold work shows a lot of imagery from nature, like these eagles here. And then a lot of them aren't just images from nature, though. They combine traits of different animals and humans into supernatural creatures. So this one on the left seems to have maybe a jaguar head, but then it has a bird's tail down at the bottom, and then all of these little elements radiating. And this one on the right has a mostly human body, but wild-looking face, and three little individuals up at the top, little creatures. A little pair of warriors, and then a double-headed frog. And this piece on the left is hinged. If you see the head and the body are hinged together, and then the lower body is hinged as well, so it can dangle and move freely. And it has the head of a bird and the wings, but the whole stance is more human. And if you look at it, it has male genitalia, which birds, or external genitalia, which birds don't have. So it's clearly an amalgam of different kinds of creatures. And on this one on the right, it's got so many of these little dangling elements on the front that you can hardly even see what's behind it. But these can be quite heavy, too, so they represent a lot of gold, and certainly they were elaborate and intended for making a nice show. Now this is gold work from Mesoamerica, from the Mixtec culture. Gold working technology didn't reach this area until about 1000 AD or later, and the Mixtec were really the acknowledged masters. And they made mostly relatively small-scale objects, but very intricate, like these this sort of suite of jewelry on the left. Those are probably ear ornaments, and then a necklace with turtle shells and little dangling bells. And then this one on the right, which is out of focus, has a little hanging eagle that is suspending an ornament with bells below it. And these are, again, cast gold, lost wax cast. The one on the right has a sun disk around it and then a little deity in the center. And there's some evidence that there was a true Aztec style of gold work that was developing at the time of the conquest. But again, because this is the culture that the Aztec or the Inca or the Spanish directly came in contact with, the great majority of Aztec gold was melted down. This is an example that combines the use of gold with the final precious material, which is feathers. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples valued brightly colored feathers very highly, especially these long plumes, which are quetzal plumes. And the only surviving examples we have are late ones from the Aztecs in particular, but we know that the Maya used this same plume because you see it represented constantly in their sculpture. It was a very high prestige material, and people love to use it for headdresses in particular. This is a surviving example of an Aztec headdress that is preserved in Vienna, and it's probably one of the pieces that was sent back to the emperor by Cortez. And you can see all these little hammered gold ornaments that are incorporated into the design. This is a couple more feather shields. They use not only quetzal, but also parrots, macaws, hummingbirds, a whole array. And they went to quite some lengths to obtain this material as an important luxury trade good and also a tribute good. So the Aztecs demanded tropical bird feathers from the peoples that they conquered in the areas. And this was probably part of their motivation for conquering in some of these areas, is they wanted access to tropical bird feathers that they didn't have in central Mexico. And interestingly enough, in seemingly completely unconnected uses, the ancient South Americans also used tropical bird feathers as a precious material. So this isn't a technology that diffused from one area to another. It was just independently invented in both regions. And in these cases, they used things like small feathers, like breast feathers, and cut them and pasted them, applied them to objects like the ear spools here. And in this case, it's a leather backing that's been cut out, and then they've glued the feathers onto it in a very intricate design. And that's what you see over there on the left as well, where they've cut these feathers and created these beautiful patterns out of it, very precisely defined. That's a headdress with the straps that you tie it on, and then that's a neck piece down below that would come around your chin like this. And so you'd have your headdress here and your neck piece that would encircle your face. And then this on the right is a whole neck piece that would come around your shoulders and cover your chest as well. And this is done on cloth. And then on the right right you see an example where they have sewed the feathers onto shell or onto cloth, and they've used larger feathers. These are both macaw feathers that they've used here, this from a blue and gold macaw. These are all Amazon parrot tail feathers, and the green ones are the natural color of the bird. The yellow color apparently was created by chemically treating the feathers while on the bird. They would rub a particular substance onto the bird's rump, and that would cause the feather to grow out in this yellow color, which is awfully beautiful, and obviously is nice and color fast too.
How'd they figure that out?
I don't know. But again, the coastal peoples mostly had to trade for these objects to the far away to the tropical regions in the Amazon, so they had to go over the mountains and obtain these goods, and presumably they were exporting things like shell and possibly dried fish, the resources that they had access to, and they obtained the tropical feathers. They also seem to have obtained monkeys, because you see those represented a lot in the art, and they would not have been natural to the coastal regions of Peru.
Any idea what these were used for?
No, I don't. They don't think they really work as fans. I mean, you can call them fans, but I don't think they really work very well because they don't stand up rigidly. So I think they were more just to flap around and display, probably. But they might have had a ceremonial purpose for flapping them around. Well, these are a couple of headdress ornaments, and these are exactly the kind of thing that you see on those Inca figurines. The shape with the little helmet part and then the ruff around it, or even the ones with the hanging elements. You see those on figurines as well. So these are pieces that are from the Inca period, or in the case on the one on the left, it's probably Chimu Inca. So it was made on the north coast, but under Inca rule. These are examples, again, where they have sewn larger feathers onto cloth, but they have cut and trimmed the feathers to get the exact shape that they want. But they're really spectacular. And although the designs on these are not as intricate as you see in woven patterns, they really make up for that in the brilliance of the colors, because there's really no way you can achieve colors like that out of any kind of a dyed material. They just have a brilliance and a depth to the color that you can't find in any other material. So you can really see why people would prize these materials and utilize them in luxury display goods. I think that's it, yes. Well, thank you very much.